So welcome all to part one of this of these sessions on public control on AI. These sessions are all about public control, and AI is said because for all the benefits that the use of AI and algorithms bring, we also need to decide how we can exert right controls over them to make sure that these tools are only used in ways that benefit society and are transparent and just and accountable. Now, in the coming hour, we'll talk to several civil society organizations about their take on public control and AI. But please also take a look at the sessions and join them in the hour after this, because there we will talk about three different examples in three different sessions of very concrete solutions or instruments for public control and AI. So my name is Linda van der Fliert. I work for the city of Amsterdam, where I work in a team trying to make sure that all the technology we use as a city is used responsibly. And I'll be moderating this session together with Pasi Rautio from Helsinki. So Pasi, can you introduce yourself?
Good morning, everybody. So just like Linda told, I'm Pasi Rautio and I work for the city of Helsinki. I work there in City Executive Office and I try to coordinate the AI projects and AI development in City of Helsinki. And that's only trying because we are a very large organization and it's not possible to one person to know everything. And that's why this is really important thing to us.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me quickly see if Matthias is there already. So actually, for now, we have a few questions to you as an audience, because we, of course, want to know who we have in the room, right? So can you maybe in the chat say where you're from, but also say if you're an AI believer or if you are an AI skeptic. So I'll post the question in the chat just now. From? Don't be shy. I see we have about 30 people in this session. So please post your answers in the chat so we have an idea of who we have in the room. Ah, that's the first AI believer. I love that. Very cool. Well, while these answers roll in, I want to really quickly introduce who we have in the room who is visible. Yeah, very many questions are coming in. First of all, there's Matthias Vermeulen from Mozilla Foundation. Then there's Jenny Brennan, a researcher at the Lovelace Institute. We have Roel Dobbe from AI Now Institute, and also assistant professor at TU Delft. And then not in the room yet, but hopefully very, very soon, is Matthias Spielkamp, executive director at AlgorithmWatch. So guys, Pasi will ask you a few questions so you can introduce yourself actually, but let me very quickly call in with Nesta, seeing how Matthias is doing, and Pasi, maybe you can ask the see what the audience has answered, if there is a general AI skepticism or a general AI belief.
Well, I think there's both actually quite nicely. And myself, I used to be skeptic, but nowadays I'm going forward believer. So this is really nice to know there are other believers and skeptics as well. But I like to ask from our panelists very shortly who you are and what is your organization. and why this is really important issue for your organization. Maybe we start from Jenny.
Hi, I'm Jenny Brennan. I'm a researcher at the Ada Lovelace Institute, which is a research and deliberative body with a mission to make data and AI work for people in society. And I'm calling in from London. So a bit of a shout out in the chat to the people coming in from Gloucestershire, UK, because that was fun to see. Why this is important for us? For us, our mission is to make data and AI work for people in society, and it's clear it's not going to do that unless it's something that can be held accountable to those people and society. We've seen recent cases, particularly in the UK, of, for instance, public sector use of AI meeting kind of high-profile issues of concern, where AI are defining pretty broadly, for instance, the Home Office visa streaming tool, the West Midlands Police Most Serious Violence Programme, which was a predictive policing tool. And then, of course, and as have been seen in also other contexts around the world, exam grading algorithms and their application and the issues around those. And what we see in those is a kind of a gap around accountability and questions around how the public, how people are supposed to be able to investigate and interrogate those systems. And so that's why that matters to us.
Thank you very much, Jenny. And maybe we have the same introduction from Roel as well.
Just a quick heads up for Matthias. Hi, Matthias. Very good that you're in now. We're doing introductions. Pasi will ask you, but take a look in the chat already for so you know who we have in the room as an audience and if they are AI believers or AI skeptics. Pasi.
Yes. Good morning, everyone. My name is Dobbe, and I'm representing the AI Now Institute at New York University. It's with slight nostalgia because I actually finished my postdoctoral position there this summer and have moved on. I've come back to Europe. I'm now in Delft. And at AI Now, I still very much feel part of the team and happy to represent us. What we've done over the last 3 years since we started is, I think, done a lot of work, like a lot of groundwork to understand the plethora of societal implications that AI is already having in society. So our annual reports are good places for those of you who want to learn more about all kinds of problems and challenges with the introduction of AI systems in education, in the government, in the homes, in the home environment, and in all other kinds of critical infrastructures and sensitive domains. And so we are located at a university. So what we combine is kind of a combination of research on the one hand, and then law and policy, but also advocacy. So we're kind of acting in that triangle. And so for us, why is this problem important? Because we do see that that without public control on AI, we are already seeing lots of new forms of harm that have to be addressed. And so some ways that we've done that is through bringing together litigators who are litigating algorithms in court. We've done that in the US and recently also in Europe, trying to learn there, trying to really share that knowledge and see what knowledge institutions like NYU and the Now Institute can bring to the context of litigation. We have a recent report about emerging regulation around the use of AI and biometrics. And we've also done a lot of work on the ground, for instance, in New York, working with and trying to hold the city accountable for their use of AI systems. So I'll just stop there and hand over to the next one.
Thank you, Roel. I think the next one could be Matthias Vermeulen. I think I pronounced it wrong.
Yes, hi, good morning to everyone. Thanks for having me. My name is Matthias Spielkamp. I'm one of the founders of AlgorithmWatch and executive director here at the organization. And AlgorithmWatch is actually not a very old organization. We only started as an initiative about 4.5 years ago, and we've been an organization with some funding for 2.5 years now. I say this because we haven't been around for 20 years, and still one of the first issues that we put on our agenda was the use of artificial intelligence, or as we call it, automated decision-making systems in the public sector. Right away when we started, we said that we have to have a close eye on the public sector as well, because we do think that the large platforms and the large companies, not just Google and Facebook, but of course also Microsoft and IBM and Accenture and the ones who are delivering these so-called solutions to the public sector, they need to be watched, but it's also very important that we have an eye on the public sector itself. Because the difference between private use of automated decision-making, public sector use of automated decision-making is that you can't escape the public sector use. As a citizen, there's no choice you have, you know, whether you want to be watched by police force A or B, whether you want to be taken care of by employment agency A or B. So there's no choice you have, and this is why the use of these systems is so important in the public sector. And this is why we already called for a register of ADM users in the public sector about 1.5 years ago, for the first time, when we produced our so-called Atlas of Automation, which was a landscape review of automated decision-making in Germany. That was a very short database that we collected because Germany is not very digitized. But what we also did is produce the Automating Society report that covered 12 European countries, and now the next one is coming out, and that will cover 16 European countries, and there we find automated decision-making systems all over the place, also used by the public sector. And I'll stop here, but not without having said that we were asked to join AlgorithmWatch and Access Now, and we decided that I would take the role today. But Access Now is an organization that is widely known, and I don't think I need to introduce them, but we sort of hooked up on our consultation, or the answer to the consultation that we sent to the European Commission on the AI white paper. And we called for, first of all, this public sector, but secondly, also algorithmic impact assessment. So this was a joint demand that we sent to the European Commission and that we also published. So much for me.
And yes, thanks.
Exactly. This is the other Matthias. Good morning, everyone. I'm a strategic advisor for the Mozilla Foundation, which is the non-profit that owns Mozilla, the company, which most of you probably know as the developer of the. Now, why is this important for the Mozilla Foundation? I think it's really crucial for us because the foundation's long-term strategy is focused on how AI-driven products and services can be designed with human agency and accountability from the beginning. And in order to make this shift possible, we believe that industry, civil society, and governance really need to work together to make actually 4 things happen. And the first thing is a shift in industry norms, where there is an increased investment in what we call trustworthy AI products. The second thing is the creation of new products that preserve privacy, meaningful transparency, and better user controls. And the third one is increasing consumer demand for these products. And now the fourth one, and this is the most important one for this session, I think, is the creation of new laws and the enforcement of existing ones that stimulate those first 3 things and which really allow for effective public control over AI. Now, we have seen like design changes to AI-enabled systems can generally be achieved by influencing the behavior of either the consumers or the producers of those systems. But we see two worrying issues here. On the one hand, we have AI companies currently having very few legal or financial incentives to incorporate demands for transparency and auditability in their products. But on the other hand, we also see that individual consumers have very little direct power to demand design changes in AI-enabled systems. Hence, that's the reason why Mozilla is also so interested in working together with cities and figure out how we can use their spending power to create changes in the AI markets. And I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you, Matthias. I could at this point tell you a bit why cities are involved, because there are same aspect as you already told, and city wants to provide many services to the citizens, and this is based on trust. Citizens have to trust to the public sector. Without the trust, they don't use the services, and we have to be more proactive and more better to serve easy services, and that's why we want to use AI in the future more and more. And that is why we have to maintain the trust we already have from the citizens. And the only way to have that trust is to be transparent and accountability in there. And also when we are going to use algorithms to do decision making, we have to be accountable from the decision. We have to tell to the citizens why they have this decision in overall. And this is why we have to be active in this field. And thank you for everyone. And I think there was one comment on chat, and that was from, I can't remember where he was, but it was about being skeptic, and that was because there's a lack of regulation, and that is more important thing in this discussion.
Yeah, maybe at this point it's a good moment to ask some new questions to the audience. So maybe you guys can, so the audience can reflect a bit on how these issues that the four speakers talked about are actually an issue or a problem you are facing now in your organization. Just to give us some, let's call it munition for the discussion just now, so the speakers can maybe even think with you on some possible solutions. So please write those in the chat now. And in the meantime, let me ask Jenny from ADA, continuing on that trust that Pasi was talking about. What would you advise cities as a key thing or a key instrument to invest in or to look into?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of areas that we've been thinking about on this, and they kind of fit into two broad categories. One is this idea of baseline transparency. One of the challenges we see is that often people don't know the systems that they're currently subject to, and I think other speakers will speak to that further. And obviously, with Helsinki and Amsterdam in particular, you've recently made significant steps in this mark, and we have some upcoming work thinking about, in a UK scenario, some of the challenges of having shared language around how we describe the systems that are in use, to be able to be transparent about them, and the mechanisms for achieving that here. But then the second piece is this question of once we know the systems are there and we know what's out there and being used, how do we interrogate that? How do we what are the things that we'd like to be able to check, and how would we like developers to be able to think about and action these? And so we produced a report with DataKind UK last year called Examining the Black Box, or earlier in the year, called Examining the Black Box, that looked at two commonly used terms, one being impact assessment and the other one being audit. And we hear them a lot, but in practice, each potentially has two interpretations at least. And so I think there's two really exciting paths. One is around what potentially we can have the developers of those systems doing as they develop them, thinking about impact assessment in advance and during the process. But the other is then this audit piece, where there's kind of two modes of that. One is a kind of external, more narrow kind of input-output evaluation, perhaps by independent researchers, and how do we facilitate that? And then there's this question of what does a broader audit look like, or in the terms we'd use, regulatory inspection of an algorithmic system, so that you can check that it's doing as you would expect, and is meeting the regulatory and normative processes. And at the moment, we don't have a perfect model for that. And that's a piece of work that we're developing, and we'd like to see others develop, is what would it look like to do a really good regulatory inspection of an algorithmic system, and what are the pieces, the skills, the teams that are needed to be in place to make that happen.
Great. Matthias, could you maybe respond to this? Are you missing things, or do you completely agree with Jenny? Do you have some tips of your own?
Which Matthias?
Oh, sorry, Matthias Vermeulen. Yeah, I was looking at you, but that's not how it works in the digital domain, of course. Yeah, sorry, Mozilla.
That's indeed like extremely valuable work, and we are very happy to assist the Ada Lovelace Institute a little bit in this endeavor as well. What I would add as a sort of potential solution, or something that we have been thinking about, actually all the people on this call have been thinking about, is really like I was saying before, like trying to think about how you can solve actually some of the problems that current municipalities in particular are faced with when they are contemplating to pursue AI-enabled systems, for instance, to improve the delivery of public services. I think what we have seen until now is that many of these institutions, they don't have any knowledge or any control over the training data, algorithms, or the infrastructure of a given AI-enabled system, actually. And then what's adding to what Jenny was saying, like cities often rely then on the expertise of the technology providers who actually have provided these systems in the first place. And so they themselves, they may actually lack the necessary skills to fully understand or audit these AI-enabled systems, actually. And then especially you have this very sort of interesting dynamic when, in those rare cases when there is actually an audit and flaws are found, then public sector authorities are often faced with vendor lock-in, which is basically the more training an algorithm gets using the data provided by the city and its citizens, the more valuable and useful it gets for the user. And so this makes the user, the city in this instance, really dependent on the vendor, as they are often unable to use another vendor without substantial switching cost, actually. And now we are a really big fan of what the Cities Coalition for Digital Rights has been doing in this context, which is this coalition of 39 cities in the EU and the US, which are taking steps indeed to ensure that cities use technology in an open and transparent way. And like I said, also in the answer to my first question, like we very much believe in cities using their power of the purse. And so how can you do that? I think it's really where Amsterdam and Helsinki have actually shown the way. It is via procurement and contract conditions, which are both very powerful and practical instruments for public sector authorities to assure that these AI-enabled systems comply with fundamental rights and democratic values. And this is going one step further beyond the plethora of guidelines that we have seen emerge in the public sector in the past couple of years. So I think if you as a city or a governance or even an EU body include very clear eligibility and selection criteria in your procurement rules and processes, you really can achieve change, actually. And that's also why I'm so enthusiastic about this project that both Amsterdam, the city of Helsinki, and that we have been doing on developing this sort of draft contractual clauses that cities can actually include in their procurement contract, so that if certain vendors are offering specific systems, then they must meet a sort of very black line demands in terms of transparency, explainability, fairness, or even potentially the use of open source software. And then I think like such contracts can really make some of the things that we have been discussing like very tangible and concrete, actually. So that would be my contribution and addition to that.
Let's see. I thought Pasi had some questions for you and maybe for the audience? If not, I'll go ahead. Pasi?
Not that much at the time. There was one question, but I tried to find it from the chat. So you go ahead at the moment.
Well, I see one question of Milou. I sometimes struggle with considering accountability, responsibility, ethics on the level of one AI system versus the overall cumulative effect on the city of all these AI systems combined. How do we balance this? How do you see this? And maybe that's a good starting ground for Roel from AI Now. Can you reflect a bit on this question of Milou and also focus on what specific solution would work according to you guys?
So I know from my interaction with the city of Amsterdam that you've been thinking about the role of AI systems within government, but also across the city. And so that's how I'm kind of interpreting Lou's question here. Is it's not just about what civil servants are using and how they are oftentimes struggling to understand what they're using, because of the lack of transparency and insight into these systems, but also how companies and other parties in the city are using AI systems to serve their citizens, but potentially also to track them, to profile them. And I had one immediate kind of response to that. That when you look more at the law side of things and at the kind of governance law that exists, at least in the Dutch context, and probably more broadly in the European context, is that dealing with accountability often happens when an event happens, or someone is actually harmed, or someone has been labeled that they potentially committed fraud with their taxes or their benefits, and needs to kind of maybe pay something back or receives a penalty. And that's when law kicks in. That's when processes kick in, and potentially, if there are channels of dissent for citizens, they can also bring their concerns to the table. What we haven't really dealt with, and I think this is really where we need more law scholars and policymakers have discussions, is about what happens with these AI systems before any event, before there's any kind of interaction with a citizen. And in the Dutch context, we've seen the system risk indication, which was a system built across different ministries and government organizations, based on data sets that were combined from different government organizations to build a risk model of citizens. That risk model was then basically given to different cities or different other government agencies to assess risks. Again, perhaps on like fraud in the context of tax or benefits or other contexts. And this, long story short, this system was ruled unlawful this year, early this year in February, through a strategic litigation case. And it kind of shows us that we don't have this law yet to understand like what is actually possible in terms of combining data and building these kind of AI systems that can be very intrusive. And that's, if you talk with the people who are actually mostly subjected to these systems, or potentially subjected to the systems, oftentimes people from lower economic status, people with a migration background are represented. You can also sense that they become more afraid to actually interact with the government because they know that, because they have a sense like, oh, maybe they have a system already in place. So if I show up somewhere at a counter, I might be in trouble, right? So this is really about basic safety and basic justice that is really at the table, or that's really on the plate at the moment, or injustice that's on the plate at the moment. That is not a straightforward exercise. So I don't have I think, in addition to all these great mechanisms like the public AI register that we talk about in the next hour, We have all kinds of technical tools to address issues of bias and discrimination, try to mitigate that a little bit. We have some more fundamental problems to deal with, and it's really about creating even more fundamental transparency about all the kinds of data that's flowing around and that's being combined. And so we're really at the starting point, and that's where also the report that my colleague Amber Kak has written is kind of giving a global survey with 8 different case studies where this is then focused on the use of biometrics, which is an inherently problematic, form of like a category of AI systems. Talking about emergent kind of struggles and successes for like regulating these systems, but also really regulating the whole AI infrastructure or the data infrastructures behind them. So that's just it's a big political struggle that I think that we will have to, that will continue for a while. And that's, I think, urges all of us to go even steps further, not just looking at one AI system, but really trying to interrogate infrastructures that these are built on.
So, Matthias, Spielkamp, you look like you want to respond to this. Go ahead.
Yes, I'd like to add an additional perspective here, not a contradictory one. I think everything that Roel said is true, but I think when we are trying to answer, we lose question, how to balance this, the fact that there are more and more systems like these employed, and what does it do to the relationship between, for example, citizen administration in general. I think we would be well advised if we took a step back and thought about what is the relationship between the citizen and the administration, and when it comes to automate decision-making systems, is there anything we can do to address this? And I think there is, and that is that we need more deliberative processes in the development and in the decision about whether to employ these systems at all. Because this is what we are talking about. Do we think as citizens that it is adequate and appropriate that, for example, a system like the system risk indication is used in the Netherlands? I think if there had been a deliberation about this, a public deliberation, the answer would have been no in the first place. So we would not have gotten into the situation where it was built with a lot of money, then it was uncovered, then it was challenged, and then there was a court ruling in the end that said, well, it's infringing on the law and it can't be used. So we need to look at this earlier on, and we can use different tools for this. Of course, the register and the transparency is one, but also the impact assessments. Before even using the system or designing the system, we need to think about what is the long-term impact of this. And I'll use one example where you can't just look at this from a technological point of view. I think we all agree on this, but what does it mean in real life? Take Airbnb. You could have the impression that, for example, they are using recommender systems that are racist because they don't want for example, people of color matched to apartment owners in very affluent, very white areas, right? Now, just imagine that this is the case. I'm not saying it is the case, right? And now Airbnb goes to great lengths to change this and to make the system as fair and just as possible and non-discriminatory. And in the end, they succeed. And everyone who looks at it, outside experts, they say, okay, they have done everything they could do to address this problem. Now, still, the effect or the impact of gentrification will remain because the purpose of the platform and the business model that is behind that. Now, do we have to take this into account? I think we do, and I think we have to also do it when it comes to the public sector. So doing impact assessment and having people who are affected by these systems deliberating about whether it is a good use of these systems would be a great step towards finding out how to balance the let's say, the risks and opportunities.
So does anyone? Yeah, Matthias, go ahead.
Yeah, I sort of want to steal away your job as moderator, because I found it a little like a really interesting thought that Matthias was entertaining there. And I was especially wondering, given that you are sort of representing Amsterdam both and Helsinki, how cities in general actually are contemplating to use actually sort of new public deliberation mechanisms in their processes, especially given your sort of trailblazing role in this sector, actually, because I think there have been many experiments with citizen participation over many years in many different sectors, and which have all been sort of characterized by specific flaws or selection bias and so on. And so there are also lots of questions like how you overcome some of those challenges in setting up such a deliberation mechanism.
Yes. Well, before answering that, and maybe Pasi, you can first answer this. I would also like the audience to think about this question of Matthias, because there's probably loads of people from government in this audience, from local government, but I think it extends way beyond the city. Every government is struggling with this issue, of course. So please do respond in the chat if you have an answer to Matthias's question. And then Pasi, maybe you can take the first turn.
Thank you. Well, we are just starting to use AI, and these cases we have used it are very, very simple cases. And in the future, we would like to use it more, but before we are there, we have time to discover about the ethics and how we can manage using the AI. And we have a new data strategy in the city of Helsinki, and we have this kind of two groups that should kind of discuss about ways of using AI and using of data. But at the moment, because we have also healthcare division and education divisions, and we provide services from there as well, we don't actually are able to even have the discussion about ethics and everything. Are we allowed to use AI because the law is there first, and it already says that we cannot use these new technologies at all in these fields. And this is kind of a problem if we want to provide better services, but we have to find the way to use new technology and discuss these issues. So we haven't solved it yet. Maybe Linda have a better answer.
Well, I can only say that this struggle for responsible use of algorithms and AI, and of course data before that, is one that's proliferant in at least all governments in the Netherlands, I think, which is actually quite a good thing, because I think the discussion 5 years ago wasn't there yet. I think even 5 years ago, privacy discussion wasn't really on the political level. So there were enough people thinking about it and worrying about it, but it's now really, it has become really a societal debate. How is our data being used by governments? And especially, are there algorithms that do like automated decision making, where there's no real way to check if that decision is just. So that's something we all struggle with, and I mean, it's the reason we started with Helsinki on trying out these instruments for control on AI, but I don't think we're there yet. We've started with these procurement conditions, which we'll talk a lot more next session, and after that, starting a register for transparency. But it's still really basic, and it's good that there are starting to come more tools available, also many impact assessments. I think now there's time for a new phase. So at first there was a phase of manifests and guidelines. We've done that up to around 2 years ago. Now there was a phase where like local governments and organizations like you guys started trying to experiment with things. That has been going on for, let's say, about 2 years. And now I actually think we need to step up again and scale up these solutions, looking for what works, what doesn't, actually go on to more national regulators and EU regulators, not necessarily asking for regulation, but coming up with like a coherent instrument set for control on AI. And maybe let's take a look at the chat. Have there been, Pasi, can you take over?
No, there has no new responses for our poll yet.
Well, then let's do it like this. Audience, you have a final opportunity for like 10 to 15 minutes to ask these civil society organizations anything you want about what you should do for public control on AI. Please post those questions in the chat. They will try to answer them. We'll have to hold them accountable to that. And maybe in the meantime, does either of you want to reflect on the answers Pasi or I have given? Roel.
Go ahead.
I totally agree with what you just said, Linda, that we're seeing, like, I think you really nicely kind of summarized like the kind of big waves of activity and solutions and kind of experimentation that's been done. And we're now, I think, seeing very broadly across like different stakeholders, different domains, that people want to see how to translate higher level principles to like the practical context. And so in some ways, what you see is lots of tools and mechanisms, but I think what we're lacking still are, and there are some good examples. I think Amsterdam, because I know it is a good example, are places where this experimentation is done in an open way and with different kinds of parties involved. So because it's really hard to build skills and all the like capacity internally, I think cities that are front runners can also show how to actually work with, especially knowledge institutions. I think knowledge institutions will be key. We're seeing, well, in the US, we're seeing public interest technology is kind of re-emerging, and there's lots of universities that are building programs or trying to invest in preparing their students to their engineers and computer scientists, but also people from other disciplines to have to engage and extend across different disciplines and prepare themselves to address these kinds of challenges once out in the world or starting their careers. And I think my research over the last few years has tried to understand, like, how do you reason both from a higher level down towards the practice of developing these systems, but also how do actual normative issues emerge in the development of AI systems. And that's a framework called Hard Choices. I've posted a link to an earlier paper. We're working on a longer version that, and I kind of working on like how to translate that to practical situations at the moment. And that's a really big challenge. It's I think we're ill prepared collectively, and we need I think we really need to also put much more pressure on universities to let them understand that we can seduce technical talent to extend themselves and work in the public sector. We've seen a really interesting case in the Netherlands around the Corona app, where there was a lot of the minister wanted to have a contact tracing. Minister of Healthcare wanted a contact tracing app, and within a matter of days, there were civil society organizations and scientists coming in and say, "Well, we have to do this in an open way with all these kind of safeguards in place," and it really triggered I think it convinced the ministry to do it in an open way. And what they did is they actually hired really great developers, but also privacy and security people. And it became a very open process with like a Slack channel with lots of people like jumping in and like helping out on a voluntary basis. So it was a beautiful example of like what can be done in, you know, and that you don't have to assume that people are going to choose a career working in technology, because now we're at a point, I think, where lots of people understand like the real challenges are actually here. I think these problems that we're talking about here, these are the real challenges. And I think we can do a better job of communicating that and drawing more talent towards these problems.
Jenny, you're on. Jenny, you're on mute.
Apologies. I double muted
the most
myself.
spoken sentence of 2020.
I know. I can't believe I was that person. So to pick up on Roel's point, I think we've been doing an ethnographic piece of research with a local authority in the UK, looking at their use of data analytics and predictive analytics. And I think one of the challenges we've seen is not only is there's this high level problem of transparency, as we don't know where these systems are being used, but there's a depth problem of transparency, which is that it's often very hard to understand, whether as external civil society organizations, as technology developers, as policymakers, what it looks like on the ground, on the front line for a team of people who are looking at or using these systems, and the capacity constraints that they have, the financial pressures that they have, and how that therefore translates into their process, and then also the nervousness that they have, because of course there are often public concerns about use of these systems, and that sometimes drives down the surfacing of these kind of issues, so that we can really understand that process in depth and understand then where what that looks like to really make it actionable and usable for people on a day-to-day basis. And then I think also to the point, the question, there was a question in the chat around kind of where in the process things like impact assessment need to come in. And I think this is one of the challenges, is understanding the flows and processes that are emerging and that are happening so far, to understand where the most useful points of intervention are. There's like an empirical question, which is at what point does something like an impact assessment actually most change the behavior and outcomes of a system? And that's a piece of research that that we're looking to develop and trial and understand some of those processes further. Which unfortunately isn't a nice handy answer that you can pick up and I can say, put it here.
Yeah. Exactly. I was wondering if you already have a title, so we can post that. But
my hunch would be earlier.
To a report at the.
Yeah, my hunch would be earlier rather than later, but there's a question about whether there's existing, for instance, is it an expansion of like a data protection impact assessment we're looking at? Is it a secondary, newer process on top of that? And what kind of part of the flow does that work into? And how have existing attempts, such as the Canadian impact assessment, worked out in practice?
Great, we'll take a look for the press release for that. Matthias, Spielkamp, you look like you wanted to respond.
Yes, first of all, I'd also like to respond to this and agree with Jenny that I think earlier is better than later. And what does that mean? It means that if the impact assessment not have any adverse effects out of the way like immediately. So of course, if you want to introduce a new office suite or something, you know, and you do an impact assessment, it's pretty easy to decide that as long as this is not going to include, for example, some monitoring of public servants, you know, which would also be an impact that is not outside facing but inside facing, then there's not a lot to discuss. So if you do that well, I think you can actually live, or the public sector could actually live with some standard of, well, you need to do it often, but it's not a lot of work in most cases. But by doing it, you find out what the hard cases are. But I would also like to give that question back to you, because what we feel in our operation collaboration and our talks with the public sector, one of the problems is that there isn't enough expertise in the public sector itself. You know, and this is not like a, you know, we're not pointing our finger. We are saying, you know, we need more support here. There need to be more people who know what they are talking about, who can actually look at something like this, like, you know, the really glossy marketing brochure that your regular IT vendor puts on your table, and understand what is going on. And there are already tools out there, like the, as already mentioned, Canadian government impact assessment, but there are also other tools around. We ourselves developed one for the use of automated systems in HR that we think could be applied to other systems as well. Basically, not much more than an extensive list of questions with explanations of why these questions are asked and how to interpret the answers. Now, if that could be used in the public sector itself, I think it could be already very helpful. But the question, of course, to you is, what do you see to answer these questions of what impact these systems have?
Yeah, and that's actually a very good question. I'd like to respond with one thing that we have been like generally struggling with, and that's that most of these impact assessments, they do consider things like how complex is the algorithm, or what impact does it have, but all those things are not validated. So an impact is what the impact is fully up to the person who's answering the question. And in many cases, that's good. It's a tool to have a conversation. If you then have that conversation with a few people that are not actually that knowledgeable about the system, or not knowledgeable about what the impact actually is. So if you don't actually introduce the people who are impacted by the system into that discussion, then the question is, yeah, what result do those answers actually give you? And that's something we're struggling with. I think it would be good to get the people impacted more into the discussion, but I also truly think there's a role for knowledge institutions to come up with some more validated like risk profiles for several types of algorithms. Hope that's a bit of an answer to your question. I wanted to almost close off. There's one question in the chat, and after that I have some general remarks about the next sessions. So first of all, let's look at Yevgeny's question about stakeholders, about stakeholder deliberation in the initial design stages. Do you think regulation can play a role in making such deliberations the new normal? And how would you carry out this deliberation in a manner that avoids technical solutionism? I think this is a terrific question, and maybe a question for like a pitch type of answer. So keep it short and a bit snappy. But Pasi, do you agree that we want to hear this from all organizations before?
Yes, I would really like to hear from all very short answers. Yeah. I think Matthias Vermeulen could start now this time.
Well, that's definitely not an easy question, right? Yes, I do think like regulation can play in a role, and we have seen this in different fields as well. Like when you have, for instance, the law requires data protection impact assessments as well, and as part of that sort of process, you also can have, or you can contemplate having sort of discussions with people who could be implemented who could be affected by such a process as well. But I don't have sort of like a magic bullet or a silver bullet or a magic solution that sort of can answer this right now, actually.
Shall I pick up from here?
Yes.
I would like to point to just one example of a citizen council that was implemented in France by Macron's administration after he imposed. So we probably all know the Yellow Vest demonstrations after him raising the fuel prices to try to reduce greenhouse emissions. And that didn't work so well. So he pivoted to a citizen council where he asked this council to come up with measures to address the Paris Climate Agreement goals. And eventually the government implemented, I think, more than 90% of these measures that came up. And so if I combine that concept with like how public and how like impactful some of these AI systems that we're talking about are, and if I then look at this contact tracing example that I mentioned earlier, where I actually saw so much enthusiasm, but also like constructive skepticism, and kind of we don't know whether these apps are going to work, but in the end they were built in a much more open way, and we had so much great expertise that actually eventually even joined the team at the ministry to build the system. Then I think that we can put some forms of regulation, maybe it's a citizen council type of thing, that then also tries to really see, okay, what kind of capacities are we actually missing? Like that's, I mean, in an impact assessment, that's one of the first steps, is like, do we even have the right people, right capacities to ask the kind of questions that we need to ask? And if the answer is no, then I think you need to have an open, like, societal solution. And then we have tremendously well-educated citizenry here in Europe. So why wouldn't it? I think it can work. And then try to think about ways to compensate and to do that in a way that like doesn't wear out our citizens. But I'm pretty hopeful.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Then Matthias,
Sorry.
please, very shortly.
I'm also an optimist here. I can't give you a clear answer on how to mandate this and what to put in the law right now, because this is a discussion that has only now started. But I would have the hope that the process itself would provide some answers to the second question, which is how do we avoid technical solutionism? Because if you have many voices in this process, then I think it's just an experience that some of the hard will come process.
Linda, time is ticking. Should we?
Yeah, well, maybe a very short answer from Jenny, if she has one.
Yeah, I think there's, to the two questions very briefly, I think there's a couple of opportunities that we could consider around the regulatory space. For instance, in the UK, there's an equalities duty on local, on the public sector, and there's questions around what equalities impact assessment look like in that context and where they could go. And there's also, I think, scope within potential existing DPIA models, but again, to Matthias's point, we're early. That's not necessarily the perfect and only way to get to think about these things. And in terms of can it be done without technical solutionism, I think, again, I want to echo this idea that to have a bit more faith in the public. With understanding patient data, which is a kind of a patient voice group in the UK, we did a public deliberation on what fair data sharing might look like with the NHS, which might sound exceedingly dry and quite complex from the outside, and it is a really tough topic. But that had really, really impressive findings and outcomes, and really showed how willing public and capable public deliberative processes are in tackling really challenging, meaty, and potentially complex issues.
Okay, well, thank you all so much for all these answers, but also for this last session. It was super interesting. And for all the audience interested in this topic, actually the whole next hour is going to be about very practical examples of this. So the first session is about an algorithm register that's started in Helsinki and Amsterdam. Talk with the developer, ask her all the questions you have. The second session is about public procurement conditions. And Jeroen Naves, the lawyer who drafted them, can tell you all about it. And the final topic is about the ethical data assistant, which can help organizations make ethical choices about their data. So join us in these other sessions, and thank you so much to all the speakers. Bye.
Thank you.